Yes, sir.
Okay. So let me just go through what we have done yesterday. Is that we have discussed about the JPA repository, and we have seen an example how we can show all the records. We have done all the records from the repository. Now, in the MVC Maven, we were having some issue when we were trying to find out an ID. We are querying an ID, but that ID is not there in the database. So with the JPA repository, how easily we can resolve that issue, we will see that way. Let us start straight away with add and fetch example. That means we are going to start with the home controller. Yesterday we were doing with home controller.java. There we were having one index which was called, and that index gave us that you should give the URL with some name, URL name, and that URL actually fetched all the records from the database, right? We are going to use that example only, but now we are expanding on that example. We are going to use the home controller add fetch Java. That is the main controller. Let us open that. Let us start with this. Just loading it. This I do not need to open because that is the main file. Fine, that is okay. Now we are going to open this home controller add, and we are similarly going to start with the getting all the records. We are going to use a request mapping, which is not a slash only. We are going to use a JPA at fetch, just a name of that URL, and that URL is going to create, or just not create, it will find this particular servlet, which is a controller servlet or controller API, that is going to that we are going to use as the home controller. Here we are using a JPA at fetch such that we are going to type this particular thing. Now what it is doing, it is trying to, it will display this thing on the console, that's fine. And it will start, it will call a JSP file by the name index item. Okay. Oh, I have already opened this one. So it is there. We are going to use the IT employee. Okay. And there we have used to return. So let me open that one as well. So what it is calling this one. So it is item index P2. I index item IT employee actually 2.jsp. Doesn't give any name. So what it is doing, it is saying this is the title. Fine. Welcome to IT employee entry. Fine. We are fetching all the records from the IT employee database. Therefore, we are just giving a message. Click on the submit to fetch all the records. And clicking on the submit, we are going to call this particular action with a method of get. So this must be referred where? This action must be having a function
Controller.
in the controller. So let's see, get item S2, items 2, IT employees 2. So yeah, so this is the function. This should be the function. Getting all the IT employees. That's why S is there. So let me check. Yes, we are with the get mapping. We are getting all the IT employees with the same function name. And by definition, not by definition, by standard practice, we all give the same function name here as well. With the mapping one and the function name should match. You can, but you can give anything. That doesn't matter. It is internal. And then we are passing on a model with an object M. So that model object M, we are adding an attribute item ITMs, IT employees. That is just an attribute name. But what we are doing here, we are using repo. Okay. Repo is what? Repo is the auto word into this controller. What is that? Item employee. So can we open that? That we have seen yesterday, that it's just a declaration of one particular interface by the name IT employee repo. But that interface has extended what? JPA repository. Let us open that. IT employee repo. IT employee repo is there is a 2 times, no need. So this interface, this is an interface which extends the JPA repository. That's all. And only we have to give the generics as this JPA repository is actually using an IT employee entity, and the AID or the primary key is an integer. These two generics will qualify this JPA repository, which is also an interface. But this interface we have seen yesterday that this is having some inbuilt functions implemented by some other class. But we are not worried about that. That is very internal to Spring JPA repository. Only that this JPA repository or this particular interface is trying to access the IT employee. If you do not give this, then this will be underlined. So you just go there, control space. You say, yes, I want to pick this up from this. So it is in this is the model, this is the entity, and this entity is referred here as generics. That means JPA repository will work on this entity where there is a primary key of integer type. This is all. These are all remarked out, or these are all commented out. Okay. So with just a declaration of this interface, but with the extension of this one, will do magic. Let us see that. Oh, did we do this example yesterday? Did we do this example yesterday?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Yes,
Sir.
We have done that. Okay, just I'm repeating just for a quick recap. Fine. And what else? I will go to home controller. Home controller says, okay, I have auto-wired the item employee repo, that repository, and I have given a model attribute and defined this data, this function model data. This is a function only where I'm passing in the model and I'm adding these 2 attributes in this model, name and table, that we are going to use in the output JSP. Then we are mapping this and we are calling this first page. The first page, this one is having one action. We are defining that action through this function, and we are finding all from the repo. The repo is the object of this item employee repo. This has an inbuilt function find all, so I do not need to define this myself. It is there. inside this repo. What I'm doing, I'm finding all the records, putting them in this model with the name items. Okay, because I need this attribute such that I can show that in a JSP file, in a JSP template. Okay, so show item PS, show item PS. Okay, it is there. I will open this. So whatever is required, I will open that and discuss. This is to show all the IT employees. And here we are saying, we are giving bold and underline this text, IT employee list. Then we have given 2 breaks. And then we are displaying all the records. Where it is, this is there in the model attribute, which is by the name items. Is it clear, this part? And then the name, that is whatever the welcome name or whatever the name that you have defined here is IT employees of PCS Global. That will be displayed. Now, can we run this? Okay, it has run. Let me go here. What shall I type? Localhost 8080. If I press enter, this is with the slash, whatever has been, the slash will call the home controller. But here we are interested with the other controller. And what is that other controller? Let me check. This is the home controller add and fetch, because I want to call this one, this URL. So the request mapping, I'm requesting this URL. Yes. So I will enter. Once I say enter, I am actually displaying what? IT employee fetch from and add. That means I'm actually calling this one. I'm calling this one.
Item 2.
Yeah, item 2. So here I'm saying welcome to IT employee entry. Welcome to IT employee entry. For fetching all records from IT employee database. For fetching all records from IT employee database. Then I am doing some submit. I've got a message that click on the submit to fetch all records. I submit. Immediately I get this bold and underlined IT employees list. This is coming from, because here after adding, we go to home controller, it will, the control will shift to the home controller after this one, and it will execute this, because there is in this index item P2, there is a submit button, and submit button will call the action get item PS. So this call of action will call this function as well of this controller. And here what we are doing, the first statement, we are adding finding all the records from the repository. That is, we are firing this query. Basically, we are firing this query. So many records. Okay. How many? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So 10 records are put into this model with a attribute name item. And I'm showing that. So show temps. You see the first line, it is bold and underline IT employees list. IT employees list. Okay. After that, there are 10 rows, 10 records, 10 objects. of IT employee. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I must have missed someone here. Okay, there are total 10 employees, 10 employee records. And it is the data is different from this table, IT employee. Table is also defined over here as an attribute. Okay. This much we have done till yesterday. Let us expand this a bit more. Let us get the record by ID. Fine. From the home controller. Let us do step by step. What I'm saying that this get record by ID, it is getting a mapping of get item PID. Now, what was from where it will get? It will get it from index IT employee 2. So let us open this and get ITM by ID. So this is the function or this is the action that I'm calling. So I will invoke this. I will make this on one by one. So this is, I'm trying to get the AID and then submitting it. Submit will call this particular action, and this action will be captured by home controller. So captured by home controller through get mapping, and then it is calling this function. So get mapping is an annotation for this particular function. I have kept the same name as the action. Similarly, model M, because I want to keep something, I have kept the attribute and I'm saying, this is what? Sorry. Yeah, get item by ID. So here it will be get item by ID. Yeah. With this mapping, I have kept the same function name. And here, because I am putting an input AID. So that is a parameter. I have to capture that parameter. How do I capture a parameter? I again use a annotation. Request parameter. That is the requested parameter. So that annotation I have used and I have said the exact name and the type is INT. And again, I'm passing the model as well. Both the things are now important. The request parameter and the model. And I'm saying that the output is I am in get item by ID. And the AID I am looking for is this AID. That means I'm looking for a record with the AID, that value. Now we come to a very interesting part. Because that day we have seen when we were using the MVC and we are trying to get a record from the DAO layer, but using AID. The same way we captured that AID with a request parameter, but then I was doing well when I was giving some AID, which was there already existing in the database. But if I had given 2, it was not showing me anything. But also it was not giving me any error. But JPS says that, boss, if you are trying to query a record in a database, in a table, with the ID, primary key, and the primary key doesn't exist, then that means that query should be returning an error. Somebody must be querying that ID is supposed to be there. If the ID is not there, then the user must not be given a blank record on the screen. The user must be given a particular message That's why we were trying that day, but we failed, because that a DAO layer that doesn't, you do not have any function which can check for the existence of the ID first and this thing. Because the once you try to do that, your session will go, because you cannot find the ID prior to hitting the database. Are you getting me? What I'm trying to say? If you don't query the database, you will not be able to find whether the ID exists or not. And that is what you are done. You are using the session and querying the database. That is fine. But in that case, in this case, I want to be made aware. The user must be made aware. First of all, if the ID at all exists, for that, JPA says I do not need to hit the database. See, if I hit the database, then we are using a costly resource, because every time I'm going and hitting the database, it can impact your performance. So leave it on me, leave it on JPA, that I know how to query it, and I will use an inbuilt function of the JPA of the repository. First of all, without hitting the database, I will try to find out. There is a way it knows how to find out whether that AID that you are querying from the request parameter is existing or not. It is internally. You from externally, your request should not go and hit the database. If you're hitting the database directly, then you are just going and getting an empty record. But in JPA, you cannot get an empty record. No record found is an error condition. And I will not display the error, but I will inform the user. I will trap the error. I will catch that error. I will catch that error, and I will handle that error to give the user a appropriate message. So that means what we have learned in Java, that is, we are using a try catch block. Here we have not given catch, because the catch is already, we are trying to do it with this. It is throwing an error. Who is throwing that error? This function. The function which is given by the repository JPA is saying that if not repo.exist by ID, this is inbuilt to the repository, that interface. And this ID it is searching. It doesn't find it. If it doesn't find, then you must throw an exception. We have given this a name, that ITEMP not found exception. You can give it any name, but then you have to create that exception, right? It is a user-defined exception. You have defined this exception. In Java, we have learned how we define an exception. Now, that means you are thinking that we have to create an exception, and there is a lot of code. But wrong. Because unless I capture or handle that exception, I will not be able to give the user an appropriate message. To give that user an appropriate message, what I do, I have created, first of all, there is an error package. I have created two Java files. One, the item P not found exception, the exception. Let me open that. It is saying, see, one-liner. This is the declare, and this is what it is. It is just a false statement. It is nothing but a false statement, such that you do not leave it empty. Because this is a class and not an interface. Interface, you can keep it empty. But a class, you must say something at least. Here you are defining a static final long serial version UID. This is a sort of a constant of the type long, and it's a final. So you cannot change this value. So this is just a false, a dummy statement, just to make this class a valid class. I am defining a item not found exception, IT employee not found exception, which this is important. This is the important part. This extends So what is that extends? By extends, what we are doing with the runtime exception? What is this class trying to do with the extends runtime exception? Runtime exception is again a class. So what we are trying to do? Class A extends B. What does that mean?
Inheritance.
Inheritance. You are inheriting all the functions and the properties of runtime exception. Okay. Runtime exception is a superclass of those exceptions that can be thrown during the normal operation of the Java virtual machine. Runtime exception and its subclasses are unchecked exceptions. That means, what is unchecked exceptions?
Which are not checked by compiler.
Oh, fantastic. Who is answering this?
Ashish.
Ashish.
Yes.
Very good, Ashish. Very good. So runtime exceptions are unchecked exceptions. That means you are not predefining the exception. You do not know the exception because it's a runtime exception. It can happen when the program runs. It can be anything, any exception. Prior to getting that exception, you do not know what type of exception it will be there. So this is the mother exception. Runtime exception is the mother exception or the super class exception. It will encompass all the exceptions that can happen during the runtime, not during the compilation. Unchecked exceptions do not need to be declared in a method or constructor's throw clause. If they can be thrown, but that is fine. But you remember, this is a class, super class, which with all the functions to handle what? The exception.
Exception.
Here, because in this exception, the class, you have not defined any functions, did you? You have just given this one single statement, that's all. But actual magic is while you inherit this exception. So this is one liner, but only doing this, will it help? Okay, let me open this controller. And let me make this file empty. Okay, what I do? Okay, I have a notepad. Okay, I can open another one. Here I am putting that. Afterwards, I will put it in. So what I'm doing, I'm saving this. So as if I do not have anything, a controller, exception controller. That means this exception will be controlled by another controller within the error package. I do not have this now. So I have only an item not found exception because I'm here. I am trying to throw this new exception. I need to have this class or the function. This new is it is creating an object from this because that is a constructor, default constructor. So I'm creating an object for this exception. If there are no exception like that, then we are defining, or we are putting that row which has been found by the AID, and this repo get by ID is also inbuilt within the repo function, repo repository, JPA repository. I did not see in the JPA repository. What is my repository? Did I define anything called get by ID? No, you will not get. Nothing is there. Get by ID. No functions. Like in DAO, Aligned DAO that we are using in MVC Maven, we were creating the functions, isn't it?
Yes, sir.
But here we are not creating any functions. Everything we have left it on the JPA repository. Only thing what we have defined is the interface. Declared. And the rest, everything we are taking up from the JPA repository because it is extending it. And we are using those functions inside our controller, because this controller has injected, auto-wired the repository. So from this repository, I can find out there is a get by ID. Yesterday, I have shown you the JPA repository. It is an interface, but with all the implementation of various functions. And one of the functions is get by ID. What will it do? It will get the record which matches this AID and put that into this model with the name item, because it is one record. IT employee, not employees. I do not need this one. Because if I have this, because I have created this item P not IT employee not found exception, and I have defined that one. That's all. So it will not get any error. But let's see whether it gets any error, because my controller is not there. The handler which will handle this exception is not there. Because I want to handle this and throw a message to the user. That portion is not there. Let's see what happens. So did I, oh, okay, result. I want to, after I have processed this AID and got that record from the database, stored it over here, I want to display that record onto my screen. So I will call result. So I'll open result. Result.jsp is trying to, you are saving the, no, not saving. This is, I can say, getting one record as well as, we should not give so big a title, but anyway, getting one record as well as saving data to the database. That we'll see later on. But what the important thing is, we are displaying that record, item. Let me check whether we have correctly defined. Yes, it is item. So result is going to display that record, and it is saying welcome back, whatever. Is that portion clear? Let us execute this. First, save this.
Yes.
Oh, I have to do one more thing. I have to open the, I have to get this AID, na? So I will go to index item 2. Oh, yes, I have already opened this. So it is there. So two things are now working. One is all the records and a particular record with the matching with the AID. Let's check. You go there. Now I will refresh this. Here I was only having one section. Now I will have how many?
2 sections.
2 sections. Yes. First, this one is to get all the records. So see, I have introduced one more utility or one more function. So I must do a regression checking, testing, that whether my previous function is also working. So I just submit. Okay, this is working as it is, all the records. Fine. I go back. I clear this. I do not need to clear this anyway. Now I will check. First of all, let me check with one which is already there. So 3 is there or 4 is there. So let me type in 4. I would like to give an ID 4. I want to get the record for AID 4. Submit. Oh, I'm getting some error. What is that error? This application has no explicit mapping for error. So you are seeing this as a fallback. Okay, okay. Explicit mapping for error. You see? That means that handler is not there. The controller. So what we do? We introduce the IT employee exception controller, which is currently blank, and I will copy this from here. I will explain you what is happening there. So I am using from this error particular URL or from the package, and I am giving this control advice. This is very important. One of the more, versatile, this is what? Like you give the component or you give the controller. Similarly, here you give the controller advice annotation. What is this controller advice? The class, this is an ordinary class. You have given the class name as IT employee exception controller. Fine. But this controller is not an ordinary class once you have given it a qualified with a annotation called controller advice. It's a controller, but at the same time, it's part of a board. The board controls all the controllers, not controls. It will say it is monitoring all the controllers, and wherever an error occurs, and if you have trapped that exception handler, you have handled that exception, it is giving you a list of all those exceptions classes that you have defined in your application. We have defined one exception class. By what name? IT employee not found.
IT employee not found exception.
And you are giving this annotation for this class. You have given this annotation exception handler. See, Spring Boot is all about how well you use the annotations. Here, I do not need to write a lot of code to handle that exception. It will be automatically handled by if you have given this particular annotation. Only that you have to mention which class you are trying to handle that exception. Here you have said, I have defined an empty, this is sort of an empty class. But this class only have extended the runtime exception. That's all. And which exception and all these things will be handled by this controller advice with the help of another annotation called exception handler. So whatever, there can be many types of exceptions that can happen. And that because you are throwing this exception when you are trying to do something in this particular function of the controller, you have to just mention that I want to execute this exception. You do not know what exception has happened, what error has happened, whether it's a in database there can be a lot of error. Here one of the error is that you are trying to query a record through an AID, but the AID is not there. So it is sort of not exist by AID. Okay. This is a function which is coming from the repo, and this function is trying to find out that AID. But you are trying to handle that exception. Just you have raised that exception. But to handle it, you have created another controller, which is controller advice class. And there you are exception handler, using an exception handler for this particular what you have thrown. And what it is doing, it is using a fantastic thing. You know, this is a Java exception. You have learned that. Okay. And that exception is returning something of a response entity into an object. That response entity is a general object. So returning this, an object, how? No, it is using this class to define that exception. What exception it is, it will be handled by this exception handler. Okay. So you have given a class, a function name, exception. And this exception is nothing but the actual exception. Okay, we will try to change the name over here, the function name, as well as this one. We will see what happens. Anyway, so what it is doing, this exception, this particular function will return a new response. That means it's creating an object. And once you are creating an object, you do not need to specify object, or you can do. You can define or you may not. But it is better to, the standard practice says you should not, because it is redundant. You have already defined it. The response entity should be of the object. Generics is object. And here you are saying, no need to mention because that will not work. You are creating a response entity with the message. And this message will be treated as a response. Response from that entity, because it is a response entity, and it will know that that response will flow through an HTTP protocol. Okay, anyway, you are saying that you are giving any message that please try again. The exception is particularly this exception. It will give you what exception it happened. And this is the general syntax. For the response entity, that function will have two parameters. The message that you want to give to the user. Okay. And here you have to mention not found. Basically, it is the status, HTTP status is not found. This is the constant. 404 not found. That not found is coming from this response entity. This is the syntax. You cannot say, I will not use this one, but this is the syntax. See, the syntax is saying, this is the response entity. And one of the syntax is that you have to give that message, which will come into that body of that body message, body of the response. And in the HTTP status, you mention the status. Generally, the status is not found. These are the constants. See, another status is okay. That means if it is okay. But then there is the another one which is not found. Not found, yes. HTTP status, not found. So these are constants. Okay. So this response body or the response entity is going to give you a lot of options. Here the option is, here the one that you are using is just displaying the message, and you are at the same time also you are, what is the status of the HTTP for which the message has been given, because you are doing something with not found. Clear? So let me check. I have introduced a controller advice to handle that item not found exception for this home controller. It will, whenever the repo saying that exists by ID, this ID not found, then we can go through this. Okay, let me save this and I will execute this again. We are going step by step. This is how you handle the error from a JPA repository. Let me refresh. Okay. Now, first of all, let me, because we have introduced some functions, some another class, which is the controller advice. Let me, first of all, check whether my existing functionality is fine. So I will check here. Yes, my existing functionality is fine for all the records. And for the given record, let's say 4 or 8. Let me type in 8. Submit. No, it is still not coming. It was not coming like the previous one as well. There must be something. What is happening? At least I should get some error, either that 404 error or some here the status is 500. So given the status, that means it is something of an error. It is not 404. Something is not found. It is not that. This is giving an internal server error. That means the application server or the web server has found something broken. Can anybody tell me what has happened? What has gone wrong? Okay. It is not a magic that you can automatically know what is wrong. Let us study the error. The error must be there on the console. Let us study the error. What I do, I will always go to the root cause. This is the root cause. Maybe the same. Yeah, this was up to this point, it was all fine. As I accepted 8 and pressed the submit, immediately there is a, you see the servlet service, some error has happened there. For servlet JSP, which threw an exception. Okay, what is the exception? The exception is saying that it is lazy initialization exception. This is a very important exception. Many people scratch their head, pull out their heads, but they are not being able to solve this. It's a very important exception that you can always get whenever you are using a JPA framework. could not initialize proxy. What is that proxy? COM, PCS Global Data JPA model. And the model, there is something has happened. That means the chain has broken. You were in a session where you were talking to that entity. What is the entity? Item employee. But suddenly something has, because here, unlike MVC map, and we were not handling the session ourselves. The session is being handled by whom? In the other case, you were using the session factory, right?
Yes, sir.
But here, are you using the session factory?
No.
Let me check. Where are our
Application properties.
application property? But that was a configuration in the servlet XML. Remember
Yes, yes.
that the data source, and basically that data source was coming from the session factory. But here there is nothing called servlet XML. Only we have pom.xml, but that is a different thing altogether. We do not define anything, give any configuration. What we do in a pom.xml, we load all the libraries, dependencies. Another where is the application. So where it is? Let us open this. Did we mention anywhere the session factory? We have directly started with the data source. Because the session and the session factory is there, but it is handled by Spring itself, Spring Boot. You are not going to take care of that. So you are not going to get the current session from the session object that we did in the MVC, right? So then what it is saying, what has happened? It is saying could not initialize proxy COM PCS global data JPA model item. That means this is the entity #8. Earlier when we run that, it was #7. It is saying no session. Clearly it is saying no session. So a session which was earlier happening with what? With find all, was not happening with get by ID or find by ID. Why? If you go to the controller, till this point, wherever you have used find all, it was working, no issues. But immediately, whenever you have given this exist by ID, so if it was only a get by ID, there would not be any problem, because you are already doing it from the repo. That means you are already directly into the database and you are getting by ID. So there is no issue. But you have introduced one more function over here. You are trying to check by not hitting the database with some other technology of JPA, that whether this AID is there in the table. In doing so, it has fired some internal query to the database. But in doing so, it has created one more new session. Are you getting me? See, whenever you were using find all, it was all in the same session. But here, this is not directly going to the database from your application. From your application, it is not directly going. In between, there is exist by ID from the repo. And that will create one more session to access the database. because it is transparent. It is happening behind the scene, not under your control, because you have left it to the JPA. You have asked JPA to do it, to check before you actually display it to the user. If the ID is not there, then please display with a proper message back to the user. In doing so, it has created one more new session, and therefore the earlier session will be in the background. It has not died, but this new session is creating a problem. No session. Okay. Lazy initialize, Hibernate core. No, whatever this. This is the main part. This is called the root cause. And if you go to this one, there is one lots of information that is available on the internet about this. But I have selected the exact reason and the way you must do it, and I have highlighted that into this thing. So I'm giving you some time over here such that you can note it down. You can pause it over here and write all these things. So this is the error. Lazy initialization exception, could not initialize proxy, no session. You must understand what the error is. So I've given all this note. You must also pause the video here and note down all this. Understanding the error. Access to a lazy loaded object outside of the context of an open Hibernate session will result in. So there was a Hibernate session created for your queries, but suddenly you wanted to give it to the JPA some task such that JPA can find out whether that ID exists or not. In doing so, it has created a new session. It has come out from that earlier session. Because session is a persistence context. Because through the session only you can save the data, you can update the data, you can read the data, you can delete the data. So you can do all the persistence activity on the database. That context represents a conversation between an application and the database. This is what I was saying, right? Through a session only, your application can talk to the database. But here you have not created any session factory, or you have not got the current session. You have not created any session object. You have given it entirely to the Spring Boot. Spring Boot will handle the session. But the lazy loading means that the object will not be loaded to the session context unless it is assessed in code. Now, meanwhile, when you have given to the JPA to find out whether the AID exists or not, the primary key exists or not, it is coming out of that context, and it can only load that context into the current session when you do something, you do some configuration. Hibernate creates a dynamic proxy object subclass that will hit the database only when we first use the object. Is it clear? Hibernate creates a dynamic that is on the runtime. It creates a proxy object which will give a proxy to this session, and it will wait for something to come and allow it to hit the database for what you are doing. So first stage is you are trying to access the database through JPA, not yourself, not your application. It's a different context where the JPA will try to find out whether the AID exists. And in doing so, it has come out of the current session. Your session will go into the background, and then the link between your session and whenever the object with some response entity. That response entity cannot communicate with your session unless your dynamic, you can load it onto the proxy object created by the Hibernate. So that means your session comes back to your current session. Your earlier your session became went to the background. The other session which was trying to find out whether that AID exists was the current context. Now, after that processing is over, it has got some entity, response entity, whether true or false, whether the AID exists or not. Then with that response, it has to join back your session, that proxy object. And unless that happens, you will keep on getting this lazy loading error. Is it clear? Any response from your side?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Oh, Anirban, you have come.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I will end at 6. You have asked to end at. See, Anirban, you cannot request all these things. If you want to leave the session, you can leave. But don't request me to stop the session because you want to leave. This is, see, you are not behaving professionally.
But till now I listened to your.
No. I'm not complaining. I'm saying because you have put in a message, a chat message saying that.
Actually, sir, my
Sir,
health is not well. So to talk about that.
You might be not well. You want to leave the session. You can leave it. No need to take my permission. Okay. But you cannot ask me to end the session.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
No, fine. But you must remember, you must have to learn all these things. Otherwise, how will you, in your corporate life, you will get, you will not be, your manager will be not happy with you in that case. Because every meeting you say, please, the meeting should end because I have to go out. No, you cannot do. If you want to leave, you can leave. But don't ask that privilege. Okay. Any questions you have, Anirban?
Sir, this lazy loading, what is lazy loading? Can you, why this error is coming lazy loading? Can you explain
No,
again?
actually the error is lazy initialization exception. That means there are two sessions parallel. So it is not being, though JPA is not finding the current session to which it needs to be linked because it has lost the session. While it was trying to do some processing in the background, hit the database and find out whether the AID exists or not, it is doing in the background. But in doing so, it has lost the session, the current session, which you have, your application has created for querying the database. Now, unless something can be done to join back to the old session, that is the session which actually your application session, that is the proxy object, you will not be, you will keep on getting this exception.
Okay.
Because see, it has to come back. It has left your session. It has created a new session. It has gone and hit the database, queried the database to check whether it is basically, what it is doing. I will show you. End of the day today, I will show you the steps. What internally it has done. Because it is a two-step, therefore it has lost the session. Now, if we do something to rectify this problem, what we have to do? There are 4 solutions. There are 4 ways to do the solution. Okay. One is open session in upper layer. I will not use that.
Then why you will not use it?
Huh?
Then why necessarily in upper layer is you will not use it?
No, I can use only one solution. How can I use all the four solutions in one
Yes,
problem? These are various approaches. You can apply any one of them. In my case, I have used this one, enable lazy load no trans property. I will define that in my where. Where do I put it in?
Application property.
In the application properties. I will do that. Such that I will enable lazy load no transaction. Okay. Such that I need to get a result of what happened if whether the AID exists or not. That if I do not get and I handle that exception, I should not proceed to the next step. In that case, what I do, I always get an empty row, and that empty row should not be displayed. See, the user is a very important customer. The customer should be given the proper advice. What has happened? So the customer wanted to query a particular AID, which is not there. So just inform him. But it is not very easy to inform him. If you hit the database, then it is an atomic process. You cannot come back and say, give a message, then go back again, hit the database in one process. No. If you want to make an atomicity, then what you do, you have to first of all make an atomicity of one process to find out whether the AID exists. The second atomicity is to inform. If the AID doesn't exist, then the customer should be informed that there is the record does not exist with the AID. But to do that, I need to join back to the original session, the original session. So in that case, I will never be able to do that because there is a lazy session, the lazy initialization will happen. So I will disable that. That is, while on transaction means that is a Spring transaction on the database. I do not want to enable this lazy load function property. Okay. So I will use that into my application properties. I am saying that these are all the four approaches. There is another approach. You can use fetch type eager strategy. Though this approach, this Spring.jpa properties, Hibernate, enable, lazy load, no transaction true. I will make that. But this approach is not the best solution as well, not that efficient, and also considered as anti-pattern. But it can immediately resolve the issue. This is one of the very important concepts, lazy. So there can be lots of questions in an interview. A very tricky situation here. I'm saying you can just go through it again and again. This is another strategy, another way of solving it. But I'm not using that. Another one is this one. So there are two slides dedicated for this. I have given enough time on this one slide. Let's go to the other slide. This is continued. Using the join fetching, but we are not using any more than one table. Are we using? We are only using one table, one entity. In that case, there is we cannot use that. But if you have to, in your latter stages of your development, you need to handle multiple tables, many to one to many role. So this is that a fetch type eager is dependent on the one-to-many annotation. But here I do not have any more than one table, so there is no question of one-to-many. Okay, and I'm not using any role. If you had that, then this one was the best solution. But actually the best solution will be the last one. But here we do not have that scope. So I have also given you that link where you can read through this. There is a solution and you can go to this particular GitHub. You just click on this particular link. So I'm just waiting on this particular slide so that you can also pause the video here and write down your notes. Clear, Animan?
Sir, can you send the link in the chat box?
Okay, that I can do
Yes,
definitely.
sir. You give the link in chat box.
Yeah, sure. Very good suggestion. I can do that immediately. Did you get that?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, very good. You can go through this. This is a very important conception. Hibernate exceptions. How will you handle this? Okay, so these two slides are dedicated for this, handling this error. So what my lesson was, I have to do it on the application properties. Okay. What I can do is I go here, I copy this entire thing. And where do I paste it? Anyone? Where do I put this configuration?
In the application properties.
Huh?
Application properties.
Application properties. This is only one configuration file where we can do that. So I will just copy this. Spring JPA properties, Hibernate, enable lazy load no trans. That is for any transaction, I will not enable the lazy load. Okay, this should be true. So once I save this, and now I run this again. I go here. Earlier, even if I was giving 8, I was getting an error. Let me check. Oh, yes. I have got the record now. Followed. That problem was solved. Even though there were 2 sessions created, one by internally by JPA to find out whether the AID exists. Okay. And then the result was not dependent on lazy loading. So let that be there, and there will be a mechanism how you can access from the earlier session that value, whether whether it's true or false. If it is true, then it will throw you the result. It is not true, give you the result, the record. If it is false, that means if it is not finding any AID of that, then it will throw that exception. Like what? Go here, control. In this, you have said that if not exist by ID, that means if it does not exist by ID, and what is the ID? AID. And where do you get that AID? Through the request param. If that does not exist, then throw the item not found exception. So who is taking care of this? Who is checking this? Getting executed by a new session created by Hibernate using what? Because finally the query is from the Hibernate. And what is the query? I will show you. Right now, do you see that in the Maven MVC, what we have done, we have given that property called show SQL true, isn't it?
Yes.
So you will be able to see the query over here. But now are you able to see the query? This is not the query. This is just the AID, which AID you have selected. You are not getting the query because you have not enabled the query. You have not configured. By default, it is false. We will also do that. Okay. Such that I can explain you how, what happened. This is also a query. Basically, it's a function, but this function is actually internally getting executed by a new session created by Hibernate using what? Using what? Using JPA. So JPA is creating a new session. Okay. And because of this new session, this session got lost. Get by ID. So first this session is to join to this session, but I do not want that to be joined. So what did I do? I have said Spring JPA properties Hibernate enable lazy load. No, I do not want to enable lazy load for the transaction. Okay. Oh, just give me 1 minute. Hello. Sorry. So that we will display. We have not configured that property. Then we will understand. Now let us execute that. Oh, did I execute? Yeah. So that I have given the one that is already existing. So 8. Now let us go back and execute something from the database which is not there. So maybe 5 is not there, right? The ID 5 is
Yes.
not there. So let's see whether 5, what it does. Okay, see, 5 is not there. So immediately 5 was found by JPA, by Hibernate internal query that exists by ID. That means this query was fired and it didn't find. So it threw an item not found exception. Okay, an item not found exception is actually handled by, this is the runtime exception, it has inherited all the runtime exception, but that particular one, which is, so it will be handled by the controller advice, which is an exception through an exception handler annotation. And you are getting this display. So what it is saying? IT employee record not found, please try again. The exception.
IT employee record not found.
Huh? IT employee record not found, because this is the message. IT employee record not found, please try again. Please try again. The exception is exception. So what is the exception? The exception is saying com PCS global data JP error item. This is the exception. You did not give the exception. You just can give to the user that item employee record not found, please try again. That's all. The user will know, okay. You can also mention that particular ID.
Sir, why /n is not working?
/n will not work because it's a response entity. It has its own format. Why we are using this? We are not going to use it in this manner because we do not have any valid front end. We are using JSP, but JSP, we are not using JSP in its true form. Just to show our result, just for our learning, because ultimately in our Spring Boot application, we are not going to use JSP at all. See, the Angular will, see what in Spring Boot you will do. You will create all the REST APIs through the JPA or whatever. You create the REST APIs, and those REST APIs, yesterday I was having a diagram. So that layer will be accessed by the presentation layer to access the service. So service, I mean the presentation layer, like the Angular or React, it will send a request in a very good form on the screen. Actually, it is firing a query or service request to the Spring Boot. Spring Boot is waiting in the background. So through some URL, it will give a request to the to this service. So there is a way how in Angular you call the service of a Spring Boot. Okay. So what is that service? That service is nothing but you are calling a microservices, which is nothing but a more or less like a REST API. That REST API is called, and that REST API will give you the access to the data and all those things. And that response will go back to the Angular. And Angular will format the response. This you are directly saying as a text to the employee, to the user. But this is for our learning only. We are not going to do this from Spring Boot. Angular will take the service, subscribe to that service. You know, these are the promises. We will subscribe, that Angular will subscribe to the data returned by the REST API. And thereafter, it has got the data and it will format the data in its own beautiful format to present it on the screen. That is the part of the front end. But since we are not learning front end right now, we are only learning the Spring Boot. We are just showing you how the things are happening. Now the response entity is going to give the response entity to the Angular as a service. Okay, Angular will then format it like the way it will do in a nice way, and will present the data to the. This is basically also a data. This message is also a data. Okay. Is it clear, Shantan?
Yes, sir.
So therefore, this is not a system print ln. It is not a console display such that your this will work. This will not work. Okay. But somehow you are getting an idea that this exception was handled properly, and you are able to give an output to the user saying that. So I will take out this exception. Okay, because now this is a different session. This AID cannot be passed. There is a way you can pass it, but that is a long down process. So better record not found. So 3 is finding, that is there. And now I will give 5. Item empty, record not found, please try. That's fine. So is this part clear? But now
Yes.
I need to find out the queries, because unless I see the query, what was actually fired by this particular thing. When you said, please repo, please try to find out whether this exists, that AID. It must have queried the database. There must be. Okay. So what I do, I fire a query myself to understand what the query it should be. It should be saying that select from AID equal to 5. It is saying 0. So if it will, I also think that they will fire this particular thing internally. It is not for you. Internally exist by ID. So this particular thing exists by ID is nothing but it is going to fire this query to the database. And if it gets a result 0, then it will throw an exception. If it is not 0, if it is 1. If it is 1, then if it is more than 0, it will say else. It will display the record. Clear? So in order to do that, can anybody help me? What should be my configuration I have to configure here? Let us start with Spring. I say dot. I say JPA because this is basically a JPA thing. JPA properties I will not do. I will use the JPA show SQL. Right? Equal to what I will say? True. Understood? The same thing that we have done in the MVC. We are doing the same thing over here as well. Is this part clear? Let me see what happens. I will go over this. I will refresh this. I will first of all do something which will give me the data. Because any new thing that I add, I must always check whether I have not disturbed the previous working function. After that, I will check with 5, which is not there. Then I will submit. So that is not found. Okay. Let me check in the background. Now you see, you are getting the queries. First query that you have done is with 3. So because whether you have done it with 3 or what you have done, the JPA does not understand. It understands that you have given this message, given this command. Whatever the ID is, it has to come through this first. And it finds that it is giving you exist by ID. So what it does, it gives you select count star in its own format, in a Hibernate format, from item employee, where item employee AID is question mark. Question mark means that placeholder. What is that placeholder? The AID value, which is 3. It finds that the count value is greater than 0, that is 1. Therefore, it will fire the next thing. Because it can fire, it can get you the record where AID is 3. But the next time you have given AID 5, so again it goes there. See, whenever you are executing this, it is creating one new session to fire this query in the background. And this session, earlier session was the continuing session. Whatever the session, you must be having a session ID over here. Whatever, there is a session ID, session. So whenever the session was established, that session is the original session. But this one is a different session. That is internal to JPA. And because it wanted to find out whether the AID exists, this session should not join back to it should not be loaded back. That is what we have configured. You are getting me? So is this point clear now?
Yes, sir.
Everyone? Anyone?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
That is the reason I have given this configuration, that properties Hibernate enable lazy load no. transaction. For any transaction, we should not enable the lazy load. Lazy initialization is for any transaction is disabled. So we can end the session today. What we have learned is a very important aspect. This one you have learned. Tomorrow, tomorrow is no, tomorrow there won't be any class. It's a holy. Tomorrow is what? Friday.
Yes, sir.
So what we do is on Monday.
The Saturday, sir?
Huh?
Sir, Saturday?
Saturday, if you want to do, I have no problems.
I'm comfortable, sir.
What about others?
Ask others if they are interested as well.
Huh? Hello?
Ask others.
Actually, Saturday I have to go somewhere, but
Okay, because Saturday,
okay.
this Zoom ID might not be available. Zoom ID might not be available because Anish might not be available in the office. I do not know about Saturday, but
So if
generally
it's
there should
possible,
not be any
sir,
problem.
sir, if it's possible, you can take the class. I will go for the video.
Okay.
It's okay for me.
When is your session? When is your class? I mean, when you want to go out?
Actually, I have to go out tomorrow.
Oh, no, better than we drop it. We drop it on Saturday. We will have it on Friday only.
Okay. No problem.
Sorry, on Monday only.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay,
Nothing
sir.
much. These are actually, we are laying the foundation for REST API. If you understand all these things, now REST API will become easier for you. Clear?
Sir,
Yes, sir.
yeah, sir.
Why we do not do this show SQL true? Because this is going to impair your performance. That means your performance can get delayed because of this, because it is sort of a log. It is writing. Anything which is writing, having an IO, input output, whether it's writing on the console or whether it's writing to a log. See, writing to a log is nothing but writing to a console when the log is on. Everything will be written to a log. So writing to a log for each and every query is a time-taking process, and it can delay your. So therefore, generally this option is made false. Just to make you understand what is happening in the background, I had made it true. By default, it is false. Somebody was asking something.
Yes, sir. Actually, before starting the rest, can you give us some time, 2 to 3 days? Actually, I'm repeating all the previous session of Spring Boot, so I can finish it.
Okay.
So I can
Before
understand
we
better.
start the REST API, 1 or 2 days can give a gap.
Okay, okay, sir.
Yeah,
Okay,
I
sir.
can.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
And I think it is better because there are so many sessions and you might be lagging behind. It is not
Yes, sir. That's why I'm repeating the previous session.
okay.
Yeah, so actually, I'm watching your Session 11 videos.
Huh?
Sir, I'm watching your Session 12 videos. Session 12 and 11 video. I'm lagging behind. They're literally lagging behind. Sir.
Okay. So it may happen. But it is not that you will not understand even without seeing the video, because the way I explain it, you should understand during the class only, during the session only. But yes, for your future, you need to go through all the videos, write down the notes, prepare well. Then it will be helpful. Okay. Otherwise, what will happen? Everything you are just attending the session and just not going through it, practicing it on your own, you will not grow that concept. Right, I will stop the sharing today and we will end the session.
Okay.
Is that fine?
Thank you, sir.